Every morning at 6:30, the same bulldozers crossed my pasture. They thought they were saving a few minutes. They had no idea they were building the case that would eventually destroy their entire operation. My name is Caleb Morgan, and the first time I heard the engines, I assumed it was a mistake. I own nearly 80 acres on the edge of a lakeside community in central Texas. Most of the land is open pasture, rolling grass, a small pond, a line of oak trees near the western fence. It is quiet country, the kind of place where sunrise usually arrives with birdsong and the smell of dew on fresh grass. That changed on a Tuesday morning. I woke up before dawn to a low rumble that shook the windows. At first I thought a storm was moving in. Then the sound grew louder. Diesel engines. Heavy equipment. I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee and watched two bulldozers emerge from behind a tree line on the far side of my property. Their headlights cut through the morning fog as they rolled directly across my pasture. Thick steel tracks crushed a path through grass that had taken months to recover from the previous season. The operators never slowed down. They never looked toward the house. They simply crossed the land and disappeared through an opening near the HOA development under construction beyond my property line. I stood there stunned. The smell of diesel drifted across the field. The engines faded into the distance. Then silence returned. I drove out later that morning to inspect the damage. Fresh track marks stretched nearly half a mile across the pasture. Deep impressions scarred the ground. Fence posts near one corner had been brushed aside. The route was obvious. Someone had decided my land was a convenient shortcut. I contacted the construction company that afternoon. No response. The next morning, the bulldozers returned. Same time, same route, same damage. By Friday, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every day before sunrise, the machines crossed my property. Every day, they added new scars to the pasture. I finally attended an HOA board meeting to get answers. That was where I met Denise Harper. She sat at the center of a long table wearing a cream-colored blazer and the confident smile of someone accustomed to getting her way. When I explained what was happening, she barely looked concerned. In fact, several people around her seemed amused. Denise told me the construction crews were probably taking the most efficient access route available. Then she said something I never forgot. She leaned back in her chair, smiled, and said, "It is just grass, Mr. Morgan." The room laughed. I did not. Because I knew something Denise did not. Before becoming a ranch owner, I spent nearly 15 years working in civil engineering and land management. I understood soil reports, environmental compliance, equipment access regulations, liability exposure. And while everyone in that room saw an empty pasture, I saw something very different. I saw evidence. That night, I stood at the edge of the field watching the sunset paint the grass gold. Fresh bulldozer tracks stretched across the property like a permanent reminder of what had happened. Most people would have built a bigger fence. Some would have hired an attorney immediately. I did neither. Instead, I smiled. Because if Denise wanted those bulldozers crossing my pasture every single day, I was more than willing to let them continue. The bulldozers kept coming. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, then Monday again. Every morning at exactly 6:32. I heard the same engines growling beyond the eastern tree line. The routine became so predictable I could have set my watch by it. The air would still be cool from the night before. A layer of fog usually hovered above the grass. Then the headlights would appear, followed by the slow grinding sound of steel tracks pressing into soil that did not belong to them. Most people would have seen the situation as harassment. Denise certainly treated it like a power move. But every day those machines crossed my pasture, they gave me something valuable. Documentation. I started my mornings with a camera instead of coffee. From the porch, I photographed the machines entering the property. Then I drove out in my utility vehicle and photographed the tracks they left behind. Date, time, weather conditions, vehicle descriptions. Everything went into a digital file. By the end of the first week, I had hundreds of photographs. By the end of the second week, I had something even better. Patterns. The route never changed. The operators never varied their entry point. They followed the exact same path across the field every single day. It was as if they believed nobody was paying attention. One afternoon, I decided to visit the construction site itself. The development beyond my property had become a hive of activity. Concrete trucks rolled through the entrance. Workers moved materials between partially completed homes. The smell of fresh lumber mixed with diesel exhaust in the warm Texas air. I introduced myself to a site supervisor and politely explained that his equipment was crossing private property without permission. He listened for less than 30 seconds before cutting me off. Then he gave me a response that sounded strangely familiar. We were told access was approved. Approved by whom? He would not say, but I already knew the answer. Later that evening, I attended another HOA meeting. Denise was there, greeting residents like a celebrity. Several homeowners thanked her for pushing the development project forward. Others complimented the progress of the new community expansion. When she noticed me, her smile tightened slightly. I asked a simple question in front of everyone. Had the HOA authorized construction vehicles to cross my land? Denise laughed softly and exchanged glances with two board members. Then she said something that made the entire room chuckle. Mr. Morgan seems very protective of a few acres of grass. More laughter followed. I remember standing there quietly while people smiled. Denise assumed embarrassment would make me disappear. Instead, I thanked her for the clarification and sat back down. That answer was exactly what I needed. The following morning, I installed the first camera, then another, then two more. Small weatherproof units hidden near fence posts and trees. They captured every entry point from multiple angles. Within days, I had high-definition footage of every bulldozer, every operator, every crossing. One evening while reviewing recordings, I noticed something unusual. Several machines carried identification numbers linked to a contractor I recognized from previous engineering projects. That name immediately caught my attention, because years earlier, I had seen the same company involved in a compliance dispute over equipment access routes. Suddenly, the situation looked much bigger than simple trespassing. I leaned back in my chair and replayed the footage again. Outside, the sunset painted the pasture gold while fresh track marks stretched toward the horizon. Denise believed she was winning. The contractors believed they were saving time. Neither of them understood that every morning those bulldozers crossed my property, they were leaving behind far more than tracks. The discovery changed everything. Until then, I had been documenting trespassing. Now I was investigating a system. That weekend, I pulled old project records from my archive and spent nearly 8 hours reviewing contractor histories, equipment regulations, and land access requirements. Rain tapped softly against the windows while stacks of reports covered my dining room table. By midnight, I had filled an entire notebook with observations. The contractor operating the bulldozers had a reputation for efficiency. They completed large projects quickly. They also depended heavily on strict compliance procedures to keep their insurance coverage intact. One violation could be explained. Hundreds of violations documented over weeks were a different matter entirely. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and the familiar growl of diesel engines. I watched from the porch as 3 bulldozers crossed the pasture in a line. Fresh tracks cut through the damp grass left behind by the weekend rain. The machines moved slowly, almost confidently, as if the route already belonged to them. The cameras recorded everything. High-definition footage captured timestamps, vehicle numbers, operator movements, and exact travel paths. Every crossing added another entry to the growing archive. Later that afternoon, I walked the route myself carrying a survey pole and measuring wheel. The soil conditions interested me. Years before purchasing the ranch, I had commissioned extensive environmental assessments because part of the pasture contained seasonal drainage corridors. Most of the year, they looked like ordinary grassland. During heavy rain, however, they became important runoff channels that protected neighboring properties from flooding. That was when I noticed something that made me stop walking. Several bulldozers were repeatedly crossing one of those designated areas. I crouched beside the tracks and studied the ground carefully. The repeated weight of the equipment had started compacting the soil. To most people, it would have looked insignificant. To someone with my background, it looked like a liability report waiting to happen. I returned home and opened a folder I had not touched in years. Inside were engineering studies completed before the ranch was ever developed. Drainage maps, soil analyses, environmental recommendations. One document immediately caught my attention. A highlighted section described restrictions regarding heavy equipment activity within specific runoff zones unless certain protective measures were implemented. I read the paragraph 3 times. Then I smiled. Denise thought she was dealing with a stubborn landowner. The contractor thought they were taking a shortcut. Neither side understood what sat beneath those bulldozer tracks. The next evening, I attended another community gathering. Residents chatted about new homes, landscaping plans, and future amenities. Denise stood near a display board showing development progress. She looked pleased with herself. At one point, she noticed me reviewing the presentation materials and walked over with that same confident smile. She asked if I was still upset about the construction traffic. I told her the situation had become very interesting. She laughed and replied that some people simply struggled with progress. Several nearby residents chuckled. I smiled politely and wished her a good evening. There was no reason to argue. The evidence was doing all the work for me. Driving home after sunset, I passed the pasture and slowed near the fence line. The moonlight revealed dozens of track marks stretching across the field like scars. Most people would have seen damage. I saw documentation. Because buried inside a filing cabinet in my office was a report Denise did not know existed. And every single morning, her bulldozers were driving directly across the section that report described. By the fourth week, the bulldozers had become part of the landscape. Every morning the engines arrived before sunrise. Every morning the ground trembled slightly beneath the weight of the machines. And every morning my cameras added new footage to an archive that was growing faster than I ever expected. The file size alone had become impressive. Hundreds of videos, thousands of photographs, GPS timestamps, survey measurements, operator logs. What started as a property dispute was quietly transforming into something much larger. One Tuesday morning, I decided to make a small change. Instead of hiding the fact that I was documenting everything, I made it obvious. I installed bright reflective signs near the main crossing point. Private property. Video recording in progress. Authorized access only. The signs were impossible to miss. Anyone operating a bulldozer could read them from more than 100 yards away. The next morning, I stood near the barn with binoculars and watched carefully. The lead bulldozer slowed slightly as it approached the sign. For a moment, I thought the operator might stop. Instead, the machine continued forward and crossed the pasture exactly as it had every other day. The second bulldozer followed. Then the third. By the end of the week, every vehicle continued using the shortcut despite the warnings. That detail mattered more than they realized. One afternoon, I received a phone call from an environmental consultant I had worked with years earlier. After reviewing several maps and reports I sent him, he confirmed what I already suspected. The drainage corridor crossing my pasture was more sensitive than most people understood. Under ordinary circumstances, occasional traffic created little concern. Repeated heavy equipment use over an extended period was an entirely different issue. Soil compaction could alter runoff behavior. Drainage patterns could shift. Documentation requirements became much stricter once the activity was verified. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I opened my evidence archive and smiled. Verified activity was exactly what I had. The following weekend, a heavy rainstorm rolled through the area. Thunder echoed across the countryside while sheets of rain swept over the pasture. By morning, water flowed through the drainage corridor exactly as the old engineering reports predicted. I drove out to inspect conditions and immediately noticed something important. The bulldozer route had created visible changes along portions of the crossing area. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, but enough to document. I photographed everything. Water patterns, soil displacement, track impressions, measurements. Every image went into the file. Later that week, Denise stopped by my property unexpectedly. Her luxury SUV pulled into the driveway just before sunset. I stepped onto the porch as she approached. The evening air smelled of wet grass and cedar from the recent storm. Denise smiled politely and asked if I was finally ready to stop making an issue out of construction traffic. According to her, the development was moving ahead successfully and everyone wanted to focus on the future. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked whether the HOA had formally authorized access across my pasture. Her smile faded slightly. She avoided the question and instead repeated that the route was temporary. Then she left. That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Yet it provided another piece of the puzzle. Because if formal authorization existed, Denise would have proudly mentioned it. The fact that she avoided the topic told me everything I needed to know. That night, I sat in my office reviewing maps illuminated by a single desk lamp. Outside, the pasture looked peaceful beneath the moonlight. Inside, a different picture was emerging. The cameras were recording. The reports were aligning. The evidence was accumulating. And buried within a stack of engineering documents was a specific regulation that nobody on the HOA board appeared to know existed. The moment I decided to use it, the shortcut across my pasture would stop being a convenience and start becoming a liability. The regulation was buried on page 43 of an environmental review completed nearly a decade before I purchased the ranch. Most people would never have found it. Even if they did, they probably would not have understood why it mattered. I spent 3 evenings reading every line of the report again. The document described runoff protection zones, seasonal drainage behavior, soil compaction thresholds, and equipment access limitations. Dry technical language. Hundreds of pages that would put most people to sleep. To me, it felt like reading a roadmap. The more I studied the material, the clearer the picture became. The issue was never the bulldozers themselves. The issue was repetition. One crossing might be dismissed as incidental. 2 crossings might be overlooked. Daily crossings over several weeks created something entirely different. They created a documented operational pattern. And patterns attract attention from regulators, insurers, and compliance auditors. By the beginning of the 6th week, my archive had become enormous. Multiple camera angles recorded every machine. GPS timestamps tracked every entry and exit. Survey measurements documented changes to the route. Weather reports showed conditions on specific dates. Drone footage provided aerial confirmation of travel paths. Every piece of evidence supported every other piece. Nothing relied on opinion. Everything relied on facts. One afternoon, I met with an old colleague named Richard, an environmental consultant I trusted. We sat in a quiet diner about 20 miles from town while ceiling fans turned slowly above us. The smell of coffee and grilled onions drifted through the room. Richard spent nearly an hour reviewing photographs and reports. When he finally looked up, he shook his head, not because he was surprised, because the documentation was unusually thorough. He told me something that stayed with me the entire drive home. "You are no longer documenting trespass," he said. "You are documenting operational conduct." Those 3 words changed how I viewed the situation. Operational conduct meant responsibility. Responsibility meant oversight. Oversight meant exposure. The next morning, the bulldozers arrived exactly on schedule. Their engines echoed across the pasture while sunlight slowly climbed above the horizon. I watched from the porch as they crossed the drainage corridor again. The operators looked relaxed. They waved at one another. One even slowed near a warning sign before continuing forward. None of them seemed concerned. Why would they be? As far as they knew, they were simply driving to work. Later that week, another HOA meeting took place. Denise spent most of the evening celebrating construction progress. New homes were selling quickly. Residents applauded future amenities and expansion plans. The atmosphere felt almost festive. Then Denise noticed me sitting quietly near the back of the room. During a discussion period, she jokingly asked whether I was still counting bulldozers. Several people laughed. I smiled and replied that I was keeping excellent records. More laughter followed. Denise clearly believed the comment embarrassed me. In reality, she had just summarized my strategy better than I ever could. Because that was exactly what I was doing. Keeping records. Nothing more. Nothing less. That night, I returned home and organized the final pieces of evidence into a single file. Photographs, videos, survey data, environmental reports, correspondence, property records. The folder contained months of documentation. Looking at it, I realized something important. The trap was no longer being built. The trap was finished. All the evidence I needed already existed. Denise thought she had won because the bulldozers still crossed the pasture every morning. What she did not understand was that the outcome had already been decided. The only thing left was choosing where to send the file. I mailed the file on a Thursday morning. No dramatic confrontation. No attorney standing beside me. No speech prepared for the HOA. Just a certified package containing months of evidence organized with the same precision I once used on engineering projects. Every photograph, every video, every timestamp, every survey measurement. The package went to 3 places: the contractor's compliance department, their insurance carrier, and the regional environmental oversight office responsible for reviewing activity in protected drainage corridors. Then I went home and waited. The strange thing about patience is that it feels effortless when you know the work is already done. The bulldozers continued crossing the pasture the next day. Then the day after that. Watching them from my porch, you would never have guessed anything had changed. The operators looked relaxed. Construction schedules continued. The development moved forward. Denise remained as confident as ever. If anything, she seemed even more pleased with herself. A few residents mentioned that the construction phase was progressing faster than expected. Denise proudly accepted the compliments. Nobody realized the first responses had already begun arriving. 5 business days after I mailed the package, I received a call from the contractor's compliance manager. The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. He asked detailed questions about dates, routes, access permissions, and documentation. Unlike everyone else I had spoken with, he sounded concerned. Very concerned. I answered every question calmly and offered to provide additional materials if necessary. Before ending the call, he thanked me for maintaining such detailed records. That comment alone told me everything I needed to know. The following Monday morning, something unusual happened. Only 1 bulldozer crossed the pasture instead of 3. The next day, 2 vehicles stopped near the warning signs and remained there for nearly 15 minutes before turning around and leaving. On Wednesday, several pickup trucks arrived carrying supervisors rather than operators. They walked the route, took photographs, and examined the drainage corridor. From a distance, their body language looked completely different from the confidence I had seen for weeks. They were no longer moving like people following a shortcut. They were moving like people investigating a problem. The real turning point arrived 2 weeks later. I was repairing a fence near the western edge of the ranch when a convoy of white utility vehicles entered the development. Company logos covered the doors. Additional trucks followed. By late afternoon, inspectors and project managers were meeting at the construction site. Through binoculars, I could see maps spread across the hood of a pickup truck while groups of people pointed toward my pasture. The atmosphere felt tense even from half a mile away. That evening, I attended an HOA meeting. The difference was impossible to miss. Denise looked distracted. Board members whispered among themselves before the meeting began. Several residents asked questions about construction delays. Denise provided vague answers about administrative reviews and scheduling adjustments. Nobody seemed satisfied. The next morning, no bulldozers appeared. 6:30 came and went. Then 7 o'clock. Then 8. For the first time in nearly 2 months, the pasture remained silent. No engines. No tracks. No diesel smell drifting across the grass. Just birds and wind moving through the trees. I walked the route shortly after sunrise. Dew covered the field. The last set of bulldozer tracks remained visible, but no new ones had been added. Standing there, I realized the shortcut was over. Not because I blocked it. Not because I demanded it. Because the people responsible for managing risk had finally seen the same evidence I had been collecting from the very beginning. Denise believed the danger came from crossing my property. The contractor believed the danger came from getting caught crossing my property. Neither of them understood the truth. The real danger came from leaving a documented trail behind every single day. And now that trail was leading directly back to them. Silence has a strange way of attracting attention. For nearly 2 months, the entire neighborhood had grown accustomed to hearing construction equipment before sunrise. Then suddenly the noise disappeared. The absence became impossible to ignore. Within days, rumors started spreading through the community. Residents speculated about delays, permit issues, supply shortages, and contractor disputes. Nobody seemed to know the truth. At least not yet. I continued my normal routine. Mornings were quiet again. The smell of fresh grass replaced diesel exhaust. Birds returned to areas they had avoided during the constant equipment traffic. Looking across the pasture, it almost felt like the land was taking a deep breath after weeks of disruption. The track marks remained visible, but nature was already beginning to soften their edges. One afternoon, I received another phone call from the contractor's compliance department. This conversation felt very different from the first. The manager sounded exhausted. He thanked me again for my documentation and asked several additional questions regarding specific dates and vehicle numbers. When I answered, he occasionally paused as if comparing my information against another report sitting in front of him. Before ending the call, he said something revealing. He mentioned that internal reviews were expanding beyond the original property access issue. That single sentence told me the investigation had grown larger than anyone expected. The following week, white inspection vehicles became a common sight around the development. Supervisors appeared regularly. Surveyors revisited sections of the construction site. Meetings occurred almost daily. Residents began noticing the unusual activity and started asking questions. Denise attempted to reassure everyone during a board meeting, but her confidence seemed forced. She spoke about administrative reviews and project coordination. Nobody looked convinced. The atmosphere inside the room felt completely different from the meetings where she once joked about my concerns. People were no longer laughing. They wanted answers. Several homeowners had purchased lots near the new development area. Delays affected timelines. Timelines affected money. And whenever money becomes involved, patience disappears quickly. A few days later, one of the construction supervisors unexpectedly visited my ranch. Unlike previous conversations, this meeting was respectful from the beginning. He introduced himself, apologized for the unauthorized access, and asked permission to inspect portions of the route. We spent nearly an hour walking through the pasture. The afternoon sun hung low above the horizon while a warm breeze moved across the grass. As we examined the crossing points, he asked detailed questions about drainage patterns and historical environmental reports. The more we talked, the more serious his expression became. Eventually, he stopped beside one section of the corridor and quietly shook his head. That reaction confirmed what I already suspected. The investigation was uncovering exactly what the evidence showed. 2 days later, the first major consequence became visible. Several pieces of equipment disappeared from the construction site entirely. Not relocated. Removed. Flatbed trucks arrived early in the morning and hauled them away. Residents watched from sidewalks and driveways as the convoy departed. More equipment followed during the next few days. The project slowed dramatically. Workers remained active, but the pace had changed. Momentum was disappearing. That Friday evening, I drove past the development on my way home from town. Near the entrance, I noticed a group of contractors standing beside pickup trucks studying paperwork. Their faces looked tense, concerned, focused. Nobody was celebrating progress anymore. The shortcut that Denise once treated as a harmless convenience had triggered a chain reaction neither she nor the contractor ever anticipated. And judging by the growing number of inspections, audits, and equipment removals, the biggest consequences had not arrived yet. 3 months after the first bulldozer crossed my pasture, the development looked completely different. Construction had not stopped entirely, but the pace had slowed to a fraction of what it once was. Entire sections of the project sat quiet for days at a time. Equipment that used to dominate the landscape had vanished. Empty spaces remained where machines once lined the staging area. Residents noticed. Investors noticed. Most importantly, the people responsible for managing risk noticed. The first concrete answers began emerging through public records and contractor communications. Internal audits had expanded into a full operational review. Compliance departments were examining equipment movement logs. Insurance representatives were reviewing exposure reports. Environmental consultants were reevaluating site procedures. What started as a shortcut across a pasture had evolved into a question nobody wanted to answer. Who approved it? That question echoed through every level of the project. One evening, I attended a community information meeting organized to address growing concerns about delays. The clubhouse was packed. Residents filled every chair and lined the walls. The atmosphere felt tense. Frustration hung in the air. People wanted explanations. Denise stood near the front of the room beside several board members. For the first time since I met her, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Questions came quickly. Why had equipment disappeared? Why were schedules changing? Why were contractors conducting inspections instead of construction? Every answer sounded vague. Administrative reviews. Compliance assessments. Operational adjustments. Nobody seemed satisfied. Then one resident asked whether the access route across private property had anything to do with the situation. The room fell silent. Denise immediately dismissed the idea. She claimed the issue had been exaggerated from the beginning. Several people exchanged skeptical looks. Because by that point, everyone had seen the inspections. Everyone had seen the equipment removals. The explanation no longer matched reality. A week later, the largest development occurred. I received a call from the same compliance manager who contacted me earlier. His voice sounded calmer than before. The investigation had reached its conclusion. While he could not discuss every detail, he confirmed enough for me to understand what happened. The documented equipment activity had triggered multiple layers of review. Access procedures, reporting requirements, operational oversight, insurance exposure. Environmental considerations. The deeper auditors looked, the more questions appeared. Those questions spread far beyond my pasture. They reached vehicle records, route approvals, and management practices. The shortcut had become the thread that unraveled everything else. The next morning, I drove past the development entrance and immediately noticed another change. More heavy equipment was gone, not relocated to another section. Gone entirely. Flatbed trailers had removed several of the largest machines during the previous night. Looking across the site, the absence felt striking. For months, those bulldozers had been impossible to miss. Now large sections of the staging area sat empty beneath the morning sun. A few days later, I stood near the fence line watching a gentle breeze move through the grass. The pasture looked healthier than it had in months. Recovery was slow, but visible. Fresh growth covered portions of the old route. Birds returned to areas they once avoided. Nature was quietly repairing what machinery had disrupted. As I looked across the field, my phone buzzed with a message from a resident who attended the latest HOA meeting. Denise had spent most of the evening defending decisions she once celebrated. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. All that remained were explanations. And explanations tend to arrive when consequences have already started. The bulldozers that Denise treated like symbols of progress had become symbols of something else entirely. Every trip across my pasture created a record. Every record created evidence. Every piece of evidence created questions. By the time those questions reached the people responsible for protecting the company, the outcome was unavoidable. The fleet was disappearing one machine at a time, and the biggest consequences were about to become public. 6 months after the bulldozers stopped crossing my pasture, the final pieces fell into place. By then, most residents had already accepted that the development would never proceed the way Denise originally promised. Delays had become permanent changes. Contractors had been replaced. Schedules had been rewritten. Entire phases of construction were reorganized. What nobody expected was the scope of the consequences that followed. The results became visible through public meetings, contractor announcements, and community discussions. The company responsible for the equipment crossings underwent extensive operational restructuring. Multiple machines were permanently removed from active deployment on the project. Additional units were reassigned elsewhere. What began as a simple shortcut across private property had evolved into a review that affected an entire fleet of equipment. Every decision-maker involved eventually reached the same conclusion. The risk created by those repeated crossings was not worth carrying forward. One evening, I attended what would become Denise's final major HOA meeting. The clubhouse felt unusually quiet. Residents listened carefully as board members discussed budgets, construction updates, and future planning. Denise still sat at the front of the room, but something had changed. The confidence that once filled every sentence was gone. Months earlier, she spoke as though every decision was unquestionable. Now she spent most of the meeting answering concerns from homeowners who wanted accountability. Questions about oversight. Questions about approvals. Questions about how something so avoidable became so expensive. No dramatic confrontation occurred. Nobody shouted. Nobody pointed fingers. The facts were enough. After the meeting ended, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted across the property. Several residents stood in small groups, talking quietly beneath the parking lot lights. For the first time, many of them approached me not with skepticism, but with curiosity. They wanted to understand what actually happened. I gave them the same answer every time. I documented what I saw and submitted the information to the people responsible for reviewing it. That was all. The truth sounded almost disappointingly simple, because it was. A few weeks later, Denise announced her resignation from the HOA board. Officially, she cited personal reasons and a desire to focus on other priorities. Nobody argued. Nobody celebrated. The community simply moved forward. New leadership arrived. Policies changed. Documentation requirements became stricter. Decisions that once happened casually now involved reviews, consultations, and written approvals. In a strange way, the entire neighborhood learned something valuable from the experience. Assumptions are easy. Records are powerful. On a warm spring morning nearly a year after the first bulldozer crossed the pasture, I walked the old route one final time. Wild grass had reclaimed most of the tracks. Only faint impressions remained in a few areas. Birds moved through the field. The pond reflected sunlight beneath a clear blue sky. Standing there, it was difficult to imagine the constant noise, the diesel engines, and the daily crossings that once defined those mornings. Nature had erased almost every visible sign. Almost. Because one thing remained. The lesson. Denise believed my pasture was empty space. The contractor believed it was a convenient shortcut. They both saw a piece of land. I saw a record. Every crossing created evidence. Every morning added another page. Every decision left a trail. By the time inspections began, the case had already built itself. That is why the ending still makes me smile. I never blocked a bulldozer. I never started an argument. I never needed revenge. I simply allowed people to make the same mistake over and over while carefully recording it. They thought they were saving a few minutes each day. In reality, they were documenting the reason an entire fleet would eventually disappear from the project. Justice did not arrive with a lawsuit or a confrontation. It arrived through patience, paperwork, and the simple truth that consequences tend to follow people who leave tracks behind.